Oh, Pat the NES Punk. He's been a YouTube and podcast staple for over a decade now. His flagship series, Pat the NES Punk, was started all the way back in 2008. He also had other side videos he would make, such as Ask Frank, Flea Market Madness, and the video game years. Pat also created a mildly popular podcast called the CU Podcast. And as someone who has tried to consume all of this content in one way or another over the years, I gotta say, Pat Contri is mid as fuck. There is literally nothing about this guy that is at all compelling. Over the past 15 years that he's been on YouTube, he's done just okay. Definitely way more successful than me before the comments section gets all hot and bothered, but nowhere near as successful as any of his peers such as Gerard the Completionist or Norm the Gaming Historian. It just seemed to me like Pat was trying to emulate somebody else's formula for success, but was never comedically talented enough to achieve anything that was exceptionally different than any other mid-level video game YouTube channel. But then again, the guy does have over 250,000 subscribers. It's almost like early on in his career, he got a huge signal boost from an already very popular video game YouTuber. But who would put their neck out on the line for this guy?
Take a wild guess.
This is Dancing with Ghosts.
All right, I want to pick a baseball game. Yeah, I'll make sure I know how to actually take the picture right. I want to pick a baseball game. Which one to go for?
Oh boy, it sure does bring back memories to see those shit quality videos from the golden age of YouTube after James Rolfe famously raised the bar with his angry video game nerd character. It's almost weird now talking about AVGN in a positive light, but you know, he was still new and fresh back then, and there was much more interesting ideas that had yet to be pursued. James Rolfe had beaten everyone to the punch when in 2006 he released his Castlevania 2 video game review. This video raised the bar in both production and writing. The video quality and editing were head and shoulders above what anyone else was doing at the time, and James was funny to boot. Just the concept of getting angry at ancient video games was so novel that James quickly grew a cult following. Pretty soon, all the imitators were scrambling to upgrade their video capturing abilities, learning how to use the editing software, and actually trying to be funny, which, as most people know, the harder you try to be funny, the less funny you become. So in 2008, when Pat the NES Punk made his debut, all the chips were in place for him to attempt his own flavor of AVGN-style videos. And that he did. But I never watched any of them, because I didn't know Pat the NES Punk existed. I only cared to watch the time-tested nerd videos. There were way too many videos on YouTube for me to even attempt to find anything that compared to an AVGN video. That was until episode number 104.
How are you?
How you doing?
Here in the basement. Well,
Yep.
You know why you asked me here. Yes.
Oh, of course.
Oh my God, Amiga in the box. Great computer system, but you know you shouldn't put it on top of the box Odyssey because it's going to damage the box. You'll get creases there and stuff.
In the Nintendo World Championships video, the nerd tries to acquire a rare NWC cart, but instead gets an inexpensive reproduction. It's at this point, I feel, the world gets introduced to Pat the NES Punk.
I'll never own a complete NES collection. Wait a minute. I know somebody who might own a real NWC. Yeah, somebody who's as obsessed with game collecting as I am.
Hello?
Hey, Pat, you NES punk. This is the nerd.
Pat and the nerd interact for over 10 minutes with some of the most stilted acting I've ever seen since James started having B-list celebrities in his show. This very public cosign that James bestowed upon Pat did wonders for his presence in people's minds. For all we knew, Pat the NES Punk was just as good as the angry video game nerd. We just somehow missed out on watching his content. So then I looked up some of his videos on YouTube.
Jeez, out of all the stuff I could have lost, it had to be something that was almost irreplaceable. Rob, I know you're joking. You're glad you made it here. That's a terrible thing for you to say. You don't mean it.
Guys, I am not exaggerating when I say all of his videos are like that. The corny, try-hard attempts at jokes resonate throughout the entire series with segments of infotainment sprinkled in whenever actual video game footage is shown. Any kind of physical gags that are attempted don't come anywhere near even the earliest of AVGN physical comedy. And instead of being angry at the old video games, Pat is just goofy and sarcastic, which has got to be some of the earliest dad humor on YouTube. So you might be asking yourself, how did Pat Contri even grace the hallowed man cave of the nerd back when it was still a show that was well liked by the majority of its viewers? Well, apparently, he just sent James a DM, said he liked his work, and included one of his Pat the NES Punk videos. James actually responded, and soon they were discussing a collaboration.
I remember I sent him like my Action 52 review, I think. I sent him like maybe the Black Box game review. Definitely sent him Russian Attack, since that had just come out, and that was my first sort of like big video in terms of like the huge Rob fight, which took like 6 hours to shoot. And he probably got like he probably literally gets 200 emails a day from strangers. He responded to me after a couple of weeks, and I was like, wow. And he said, hey, he basically said, I'm not giving away private information, but he said, hey, I enjoyed your videos. Maybe we could just say hi to each other and meet up at SGC. And I was like, wow, that's pretty cool.
Now, Pat's big claim to fame that everybody pretty much knows about him is that he owns every single North America original Nintendo game. If you're not a video game collector, this may not seem like a big deal, but it is on some level if you're really into the sport of collecting, I guess. Take, for instance, the game they were mentioning in the nerd video, Nintendo World Championships. This game fetches six-figure amounts these days on websites like eBay. Now, before you start running to your grandma's closet, 99% of the Nintendo library doesn't come anywhere near that number, but there are some rare and expensive games in that collection. And if you think Pat doesn't wear this as a chip on his shoulder, you'd be gravely mistaken. Most of Pat's personality is wrapped up around the fact that he owns a lot of rare games and has for a long time. Just the fact that Pat had a Nintendo World Championship Edition cart and James didn't was probably reason enough to have Pat on the show. Much like James, Pat also did a series of side videos such as Ask Frank and Flea Market Madness. Now, Frank is an old dude who is apparently one of Pat's best and probably only true friends. Being that Frank is a boomer in every sense of the word, the Ask Frank series was a single camera shot where fans would ask questions of Frank and chortle at his perspectives.
How come you're so cool?
Wow, thank you. I don't know, I'm just be yourself.
I consider Frank a civilian in all of this. He's only ever tried to be a friend to Pat and could really care less about being on YouTube or garnering acclaim, unlike Pat, who is absolutely obsessed with both of those things. I won't be saying anything else about Frank because he seems like genuinely a good dude and someone that my dad would have been best friends with, probably. Flea Market Madness, especially the older episodes, is probably my favorite thing that Pat has ever done. Though it may not have been the first time somebody went searching for video games at a flea market POV style, I feel like Pat probably made video game deal hunting more popular with other people following suit after his series garnered some traction. Pat would wear his little spy glasses and straw hat as he bounced around from booth to booth buying mostly junk or crappy action figures that reminded him of his youth, but every now and then he'd find some killer deals on some rare retro video games. You can kind of see how he built up his video game collection so quickly by doing this. The guy had dedication. I mean, I certainly wouldn't dream of waking up at 6 a.m. to be at a flea market by 8, but Pat did that for years. He would later say in his podcast he would leave his girlfriend half naked in bed while he went and bought video games at the flea market. Priorities, am I right? The sellers at these flea markets weren't immune to Pat's dad vibes, and that was one of the more painful parts about watching this series.
Rub and play Michael Jackson, all right. I don't want to rub and play with Michael Jackson, but that's a thing.
You could see the title shift as the years went on, however, as sellers realized what games they had and started pricing them accordingly. No more sweet deals to be had for Pat. Also, in the earlier episodes, it was common to see NES and Super Nintendo games for sale, but towards the end, it was all Xbox and PS2 games, And I don't know about you, but neither one of those gaming libraries does anything for me sexually. In 2013, Pat would launch what would go on to become his bread and butter, the CU Podcast, or more formally, the Completely Unnecessary Podcast. After spending numerous hours at a video game store called Luna Video Games, Pat struck up an acquaintanceship with one of the employees, Ian Ferguson. Their conversations were so long and robust that Pat saw yet another opportunity to throw some more spaghetti at the wall and create a podcast. The CU Podcast was born, and its style of taking controversial video game topics and chopping them up into digestible YouTube segments proved to be a hit for Pat's fledgling channel. I feel like most people stumbled upon this podcast via the YouTube algorithms. That's how I found it anyway. Podcasts were in their middle age at this point, and the market had yet to be flooded with millions of choices for whatever you might be into. There were only thousands of choices. The CU Podcast became a fairly popular video game podcast, and at first, I really enjoyed it. I would say around 4 or 5 years in, however, the podcast started getting stale. First, let's talk about this Ian Ferguson guy. On the surface, he's your average video game or record store employee. Perpetually stoned, condescending, definitely gives off some hipster elitist vibes at certain points. The guy doesn't seem to possess many social skills, but aside from that, I think after the first couple of years, Ian just lost all interest in doing the podcast. There are so many episodes where his thoughts and opinions feel completely phoned in. Pat would go on this long and passionate rant about some menial piece of gaming news and then toss it over to Ian, only for Ian to just sit in his chair and be like, yeah, sure. And it's like, I don't think I've ever seen someone so checked out from their own podcast, aside from maybe James Rolfe. God, could you see the two of those guys hosting a podcast, Ian and James? That would be the most autistic podcast ever witnessed. But seriously, it's like, we the listeners feel the pain of you not wanting to be there. So just leave. It's so hard to listen to something when you feel like one of the hosts is being held against their will. Another thing, I don't think Ian actually likes Pat, like, at all. There have been so many times where Ian has had to explain something to Pat with clear annoyance in his voice, or he'll like just roll his eyes at Pat or just mock him in some way, and then he'll usually force like a chuckle in somewhere so it doesn't come off as completely hostile, but any chemistry they might have had is long gone. On the other hand, you have Pat, who is a complete narcissist. The guy thinks the world of himself. He thinks he's fucking hilarious, oftentimes laughing at his own statements. And yes, they are statements, they are not jokes. In doing research for this video, I've seen from multiple sources, even Pat himself on his Not So Common podcast, that he is admittedly unliked by many people in the retro gaming scene. And after listening to a few episodes of their podcast, you can just feel the hubris and ego dripping off this guy. Like, just because you own a lot of video games, that doesn't make you an authority on the topic.
And I'm sitting here in San Diego. This isn't a woe is me. There's like no one out here. Ian has, his job at the store, and he's heard a lot. And the other collectors in San Diego, most of them don't like me. So it's like, it's a rough spot. But whatever. That's why I like talking to you guys. I'll live vicariously through someone like you that has a nice community.
But with all that being said, this podcast should have really only focused on video games and should have never veered off into wrestling, sports, movies, food, whatever. These are all topics Pat and Ian would heavily discuss, which had me reaching for the skip button with the quickness. Recently, if you check in with the podcast, you'll hear mainly about video game preservation and WADA. WADA is a company that rates the physical condition of video games, and Pat just can't get enough of these guys. This might be a bad take on my part, but outside of a couple of 40 and 50-year-olds, who really cares this much about video game preservation? I get spending one segment of one podcast talking about preserving old game cartridges, but these dudes bring it up in nearly every episode, or they'll bring up some video game that was sold at auction for an absurdly high price. I believe Pat is constantly hammering this shit home because he has a very vested interest in what happens with the prices of retro video games, since it's been his life's work for nearly the past 20 years. Pat's NES collection is his golden parachute into retirement, and if that market dries up, Pat might very well be fucked. Put it this way. If Pat never bought one single NES game and only ever used an EverDrive, I do not think we would be hearing about all this WADA and video game preservation shit. It's just fucking boring to listen to. Even if WADA is a corrupt company or not, I don't care. It's a boring ass topic. On the other hand though, There were some highlights of the podcast. For instance, the massive Intellivision Amico debacle that definitely breathed a little bit of life into the dying podcast. The Amico was a gaming console that everyone had a raging hard-on for, except Pat and Ian, who predicted the console would either fail or not even come to market to begin with. They caught a lot of shit for constantly hating on the Amico, but they turned out to be 100% right, and there were a lot of baby YouTubers who made videos shilling for this product who had to eat a lot of crow. I myself was never interested in that stupid thing from the get-go, plus Tommy Tallarico, to me, has always come across as that guy in the club that you always have to watch your drink around, if you know what I mean. Anytime the guys would cover a scammy-looking gaming system, that was always a highlight for me. The CU podcast definitely had its share of L-takes, though. These guys are probably at least a decade older than many of their listeners, so whenever anything involving more online-based content would hit the news, Pat and Ian, they were usually pretty befuddled by it. Take the Diablo mobile game debacle. Blizzard put out a version of Diablo that was only available on mobile devices and was filled with microtransactions. The fans of Diablo were very vocal about their disdain for this maneuver, but Pat and Ian basically just mocked them and accused them of being entitled babies.
You're all fucking babies.
Yeah.
All of you who applauded. You're all babies. You're rude, first of all.
Yeah.
But you're all fucking babies.
Yeah, way to put someone on the spot who, like, probably... I mean, it's not like they made the final fucking call.
No. And they're not the ones who made the call for not announcing anything else. And you're putting it on them, making them feel fucking stupid. For your little fucking... Little 5 minutes of internet fame in your fucking video. It's disgusting. And they're the reason you're there. Because they gave you these franchises for you to go to fucking BlizzCon.
Yeah.
Looking back now, this seems like such a bizarre take on the situation. As a result of their mockery, many fans turned against Pat and Ian. There was also the thing with PewDiePie dropping the N-bomb, which led to Ian's famous, "His heart is a sewage pump" quote.
But they're not all 12-year-olds. They're 14 and 15.
His heart's a fucking sewage pump.
Which kind of became a meme there for a bit for being such just an over-dramatic, cringy statement. Well, that was at least my takeaway from it. So another series that Pat attempted was the Video Game Years. This was a series that tried to be in the same format of a show such as I Love the 80s on VH1 or something you might have seen on G4 in the early 2000s. Why, in 2015, Pat thought this would be content that people would want to watch on YouTube is beyond me. He would consistently say how this show had such high production value and how he even tried selling it on Amazon, which would have been kind of hilarious if Amazon had picked this show up. I don't know. This show just kind of looks like ass to me, to be honest. Like a bunch of mid-tier YouTube e-celebs sitting in front of a shitty green screen describing what a Game Boy is when your entire audience base are people who are well aware of what a Game Boy is. There were just so many other media outlets that have done shows like this but done them better, and that talking head style of infotainment was out of date even back in 2015. Then we have the books. The NES books have controversies all their own, and honestly, I don't really give a shit about them, but I guess you do, so here goes. There was a writer named Brett Weiss who had contributed like 60 of his reviews for Pat's first edition of his Ultimate Guide to the NES book. But upon the third edition, Pat removed all of Brett's reviews and redid them. Pat also soured on Brett because apparently Brett was writing a Super Nintendo book around the same time as Pat's Super Nintendo book. So Pat blocked Brett on social media and wouldn't respond to his messages. If you check Brett's website, he assumes Pat did all this because Pat saw him as the competition. Are we noticing a pattern here yet? Having a fragile ego plus heaps of narcissism equals not being a very likable guy. Now, God, this thing's fucking heavy. I bought Pat's first NES book back in the day because it just seemed like a cool idea, and I had already purchased Jeffrey Wittenhagen's Super Nintendo book because I really enjoyed this one, so I was like, oh, I'll enjoy this one too. But upon receiving Pat's book, it felt wordy and the reviews felt a little too long and meandering. I found myself honestly just looking at the screenshots inside of the book instead of reading the actual reviews. And apparently Pat's buddy Norm felt the same way.
Although the reviews are full of good information, the write-ups are kind of bland. They are very basic descriptions that tell you about the game and how it plays. These aren't very fun to read, but eventually I just stopped reading the descriptions and only read the reflections. If I wanted to know what kind of game it was, I just looked at the 4 screenshots at the bottom.
Ouch. That had to have hurt on some level. Pat took an opportunity to clap back at Norm when he appeared on Pat's Not So Common podcast.
Yeah, and I hope my check's in the mail for that review because...
Well, not if you said the what was that I had an issue with? You said the reviews were a little bit, you said pedestrian or dry?
Bland.
You said they were bland, and then you said, oh, that's not that bad. I'm like, that's pretty bad. I said, you could have used dry. Dry sounds better than bland.
Trust me, if Norm the gaming historian didn't have 4 times the subscribers as Pat, he would have gotten it a lot worse. At the end of the day, I don't see what specific value or talent Pat brings to the table. His books are okay. The podcast is okay. All the bajillions of projects he's undertaken are just okay. Except Pat the NES Punk videos, those are actually pretty fucking far from okay. They're quite bad. Ultimately, I think Pat has fallen short of emulating his idol James Rolfe, who, for better or worse, will definitely be remembered long after he finally retires, if that ever happens. But, Pat clearly is doing something that people like. He was able to get the catapult from James Rolfe and run with it and sustain it. Pat is a complete convention whore as well, so apparently some people out there do actually want to see him. That's more than what I can say for my band. I just think the dude has compromised every step of the way to try and gain the adoration that he so desperately craves from the general public. I mean, why else would you go on a garbage show like Pawn Stars and act like you're going to sell your Nintendo World Championship cards, knowing that there's no chance in hell that you are actually selling your precious game cartridges to these con men, but you just so badly want to be on TV that you act like you're going to do it? I feel kind of bad for the guy when I objectively look at his life. Like, still living alone in your 40s is a reality that not many people want for themselves. Just surrounded by rooms full of ancient relics from childhood. I mean, who doesn't like to dip their toes into the nostalgia fountain every now and then? I think it's only natural, but this dude set up a house in the nostalgia fountain and lives there. We go about our days as the adults that we've become after we, watch an old movie from our childhood or play an old video game that reminds us from, about being kids or whatever. It's like, cool, do that, and then you go back to, your normal adultness. But, Pat just perpetually lives in this state of, being a 10-year-old. I guess just shit got really bad for him as he got older. I'm also not saying that there's anything wrong with collecting things, but I do feel like there's a difference between collecting and hoarding. With Pat, God, it's got to get awfully lonely at night when he's lying in bed with only the Donkey Kong plushies keeping him company. Godspeed, NES Punk, and enjoy one of Frank's Italian sausages on me. Or for me or something. Anyway, that's every drop of shit I have to say about Pat the NES Punk. I did not want this video to end up being this long, but son of a bitch! Here we are. Anyway, as always, let me know what you think about Pat the NES Punk in the comments below, and until next time, have a good rest of your night. And as a result of me doing this video, I may actually end up on one of Pat's podcasts because he tends to like to talk about people who make videos about him.